My name is Paylin Yu. I am currently an archaeologist with the Corps of Engineers, Walla Walla District, formerly of Boise State University. And I am one of two people who really got involved with this project for the last 2+ years. And we'll talk a minute about how that came about.
So I am Nikki Gurrell. I am the head of the anthropology program at College of Western Idaho. I first met Mark Plew back in 1997. He's been my mentor ever since. I wouldn't be here where I am without his guidance and support. And so I've known Paylin for a few years now, and once we realized we both had this Mark connection, and after reading his memoir, we decided that maybe there was a little bit more to the story that could bring some texture and color to the written work. And so we conceived of this sort of, oral aspect to do these interviews.
And I think that we had actually spoken with Mark about his memoir. I forgot to mention, I'm glad you raised it. I met him in the early 1990s after some Venezuelan field work, and I met Russell at the same time, Russell Gould. So we both realized that Mark's, sort of deep knowledge and history of archaeology, and particularly Idaho archaeology, was partly reflected in the memoir. And the memoir is fantastic, but even he himself said that he hadn't really gotten into everything he wanted to get into. Mm-hmm. And we thought that maybe something live, something verbal in an interview situation would be a real nice complement to that.
Yes, and so we've just closed now with this sort of group interview with 3 of his colleagues, longtime colleagues and a former student, and hoping that will kind of round out the personal perspective a little bit more broadly for Idaho archaeology.
I think that one of the things that was really cool about his memoir was how he opened with a little bit of his early life and childhood, mm-hmm. and his memories and knowledge about some of his family's experiences, about his own experiences going to Germany and exploring some of his family history. And I think that the first interview set really drew out some of that. Sort of before I was really into archaeology, kind of, how do people come into this field? Mm-hmm. The second set of questions in the second interview was a little bit more really onto archaeology and how he himself as a scholar sort of had evolved and where he saw the field that he's given so much to, where he thinks he sees it going and where he hopes to see it going. Mm-hmm. And that was really, for me, a phenomenal experience just to hear him saying these things. Mm-hmm. Because I've known him forever, and I consider him a mentor, although I never call him that because he would object. And then this third interview, which is with Jim Woods, Russell Gould, Tom Green, and Mark, really was around some colleagues. Mark has dozens, if not hundreds, of colleagues, so it was really hard to choose a smaller group. But these colleagues are some of the people who have worked really in the traces with him really closely. Mm-hmm. And we thought that if they were all able to sort of bounce off each other,
it would table.
Yeah, it would and it would throw new light onto the first two.
Right.
That was our strategy.
Yeah, and it seems to have gone well.
Yeah, I think it is, and honestly, I don't think that there has been as much appreciation of Idaho archaeology and Idaho archaeologists as there has been in other areas that are maybe a little bit, have a higher density of archaeological practitioners. Mm-hmm. And some of the things that will come out in these interviews are maybe why Idaho archaeology is so unique, and how the practitioners and the people who are teacher scholars in Idaho archaeology are really engaged with a past that is not like any other. Mm-hmm. There's some real unique aspects of the past in Idaho and of Idaho's traditional cultures, especially talking about pre-contact peoples. And I think the next step, as we sort of talked about, is to bring more and more descendant communities and indigenous experts into these conversations. Maybe that would be another project for the future.
And to make Idaho archaeology more accessible
Yes.
right? For any student or researcher that's interested in these topics and themes. So that's what we hope to do with this project. Well, hello. Mark, we are here to start a series of 3 archaeological conversations with Dr. Mark Plew, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Boise State University. So this first in a series of 3 is going to really cover more of sort of your childhood, your youth, your background, getting into the discipline, what it is to be an educator and those kinds of things. And this is sort of a compendium to your book, Passing Through an Idaho Archaeologist's Memoir, which came out in 2019, I think?
2018.
2018. But let's first start out with talking about your childhood. Set the scene for us as a kid coming of age in Bloomington, Indiana, and maybe a little bit about that.
Well, I've thought about that for a long time, but growing up in Bloomington, which is a very typical Midwestern town, I think, particularly a Midwestern town that has a university.
Mm-hmm.
Bloomington was, and I think probably still is, relatively conservative. Having the university there sort of changes the connection that some of us developed, I think, pretty early on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say that the university probably it was an early driver in my life, and because my father, my grandparents, had ties to the university in different ways.
When you started to come into your own mindset, people are asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up, or you're starting to think about your future. What kind of things came to mind for you?
I was training as a classical musician.
Mm-hmm.
I was a violinist. Started to pick up the violin when I was 5 years old. Auditioned for the School of Music in Indiana, one of the top schools in the world.
And did that, when you say you picked up a violin, was that something that your parents encouraged you to do, to become musically inclined, or was that something you just found yourself drawn to?
Well, my mother played the piano. My father, I don't think, was particularly musical, but an appreciator. My grandfather, who was very important in my early life, my life generally, my grandfather was a great fan of violin. He followed a lot of sort of famous early 20th century violinists. Always used to talk about going to the Fritz Kreisler concert on the campus that he had attended. My uncle was quite an accomplished violinist.
And is this on your mother's or father's side?
On my father's side.
At what point did you start diverging from that?
Well, when you play violin for a long time, and classical music is... the classical musicians are a special breed, I think.
Uh-huh. As are archaeologists.
As are archaeologists, but as I can reflect on it now, I think that it requires a level of focus that I think a number of other pursuits probably do not in reality. But they weren't primary, and I didn't see myself on a track to become a paleontologist or ultimately an archaeologist.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about. At what point, because I'm assuming you're in your mid to late teens at this point, at what point do you start sort of realizing that you're observing the world through an anthropological lens, if that makes any sense? And was anthropology on your mind? You mentioned paleontology a few times, but was the study of humans and past societies and all of that, when did that sort of rise to the top in terms of thinking about what track you really wanted to be on if it wasn't going to be in a symphony?
Musical career. Thought I had some talent. I didn't have innate talent for where I've kind of landed. I think one of the things that doesn't happen often enough to students is that you have that opportunity to have to face the reality of not being able to maybe do or be as good at something as you would like to be. So that was good. And I went off, kind of pulled away from music. Was a geology major for a short time because I had those kind of interests. Was an English major for a very short time.
And you were learning German at this time too, weren't you?
Yeah, German was one of the language I'd taken in high school, and I continued on with that. Took a couple of classes. It was a combined archaeology, biological physical anthropology.
Oh, like a 4-field overview.
Kind of. And in that context, it really kind of clicked for me. I realized that that was something that I really was interested in.
I want to talk about mentorship. I know you've been on both sides of this, right? You've both obviously been mentored, as a youth coming into your own with anthropology and archaeology, and then of course, eventually the tables turn and you become the mentor.
My grandfather was an incredibly avid reader. We lived, fortunately, as I thought about it, only about 2 blocks away from him. So I spent many summer afternoons, just listening to him sort of rattle on about this, that, and the other. We might move from Darwin to Schopenhauer, in the course of a single conversation. He had come back from the First World War and become very much of a socialist, very interested, great fan of Eugene Debs, and actually worked in the campaign for Norman Thomas. So he was a great mentor, I think, just in terms of kind of stimulating, an interest in academic things. I guess I would say that, at another time and place, I might not have thought about it in this way, but I think the people that I studied violin with, were helpful in that way as well. Dr. Hurt, as I called him up until the last time that I saw him, the things I learned from Hurt were things about being professional. The responsibilities of really getting done what we're supposed to do, the follow through, the trying to sort of do right, be right in terms of dealings not only with the archaeological record but with the people that we work with in that regard, a number of different stakeholders. The other person is Patrick Munson, who was the only person, as I remember, who caused Benford to back down in print. I learned a lot from him. He was our new archaeologist at the time that I was beginning graduate school at Indiana.
So when did you start to feel like you were becoming a mentor? Did that happen as soon as you became an educator, or did you kind of feel like you grew into that?
Oh, I think it's something you grow into. I think most faculty probably early on, you've got all of this energy and you want everybody to love you and so forth because you think you're doing such an incredible job. And you have only their interests at heart. I don't think I became a really good mentor until I became old. And I don't mean that old necessarily as we sit here at the present time, but I think as you mature in the practice, you become a better mentor because you have the time to realize what really works for students and what doesn't work. Just telling them, things they want to hear, giving them the nod, the pat on the back, that's a part of it. But at the end of the day, I think to go back to talking about honesty in terms of what you tell people is probably the best thing you can do in terms of mentoring them. That's not to say that I haven't, and I think most people do. We're willing to do whatever we can for those students that really, first of all, want to be mentored, because everybody doesn't accept mentoring in the same way. But for those who do, and the students that you come to quickly to understand really want to do something with the discipline, you invest enormously in them.
So I know you mentioned earlier your brothers, and you said they're teachers too, and that was an interesting comment because it strikes me that you could be an archaeologist without being also an educator. So what made you decide to combine those interests? Did you know that you wanted to teach? Was that something that came to the fore, or how did that all come about?
Well, listen, I think almost everybody I ever knew at the university, students, friends of mine and so forth, everybody at some point thinks about being a teacher. And I did. Indiana has one of the largest schools of education in the country. I think they still turn out more teachers across all divisions than almost any university. So I signed on for a short run as an education major without any real sense about what I wanted to do in it. Fortunately, Indiana did then and still does, I think, have a class called F100, aptly named, taught by Miss James, as I remember her even to this day. That class ended any interest of ever being an educator. Didn't want to go there. But I'm not an educator. I don't think that's not how I think of myself. And I wasn't trained in that regard. I'm a researcher, and you're trained to be a researcher. We teach as part of what we do in the university setting, and most of us, I think, like that. We enjoy the operation that we have in that capacity in terms of being able to take what we do as researchers and kind of bring it in, But teaching is not something that I really see myself as. I never took a course on how to teach anything or anybody. And I remember, and I was thinking just the other day about time that when I was working with Carl Vogelin, the linguist. Vogelin always said, with graduate students, so you can't teach them anything. You simply create an environment within which they can learn, and they have to do it on their own. And that, of course, is true, because if they get that right, they'll be successful
In whatever they do,
careers
right?
they want to do.
Yeah.
So I guess that's for me kind of the division in that regard.
Are there any particular topics or themes that you have expressly enjoyed teaching over the last many decades? Things that you just love coming back to again and again, that you really feel inspired to communicate to the classroom? How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm not sure where you're going with that question, but I would say this about classes that I've taught. I don't know that teaching an introductory archaeology class was ever my favorite thing. In fact, amongst introductory classes that I've taught, I really enjoyed teaching biological anthropology. It was more diverse, it was more challenging, and so forth. I think on the archaeological side, the part of teaching that I enjoyed the most was really getting people to think more critically about how we think about archaeological data. Get people to the point where they're really kind of thinking about, well, where do we go with this? I've enjoyed talking about the history of the discipline as well.
Right.
Something that I think we've kind of moved away from generally, but I think it's still very, very important.
So, Mark, let's pick up on diversity in anthropology. So many disciplines these days are talking about how they can be more inclusive and reach out to a diverse, demographic of gender and ethnicity. How do you feel that anthropology is maybe uniquely suited to meet those objectives of being inclusive to a wide array of diversity of students, for example, coming into the field?
Well, I think historically, and perhaps this is a reason for talking about the history of a discipline occasionally, I think historically the field has been one which has done that. If you look at archaeology, for example, in the 19th century, early 20th century and beyond, a lot of women have been very prominent players in the discipline in a number of different ways, and at all levels. And in recent decades, we've seen a balance even in university faculties, academic faculties. So in that regard, I mean, the discipline has a solid history. I think the discipline attracts a lot of people from a lot of different areas, regardless. A lot of different tracks that you can take, even in archaeology. There's a lot of room for exploring in terms of whether you want to do prehistoric, historic, archaeology. And so I think, the discipline generally has been encouraging to a lot of people. At the same time, while we have there's a noticeable diversity in the discipline in gender, we have been less successful in bringing into the discipline persons from other cultural groups.
Well, let's shift gears and talk about Guyana. So this is a former British colony, and you've done decades, I would think.
30-some years.
30-some years of archaeological field work there. Can you talk to us, tell us a little bit about how you got involved there, what your collaboration with folks in Guyana and the government and what all that is?
Well, one of the things that and I think it's probably, again, time and place, but when I was coming up as an undergraduate student and looking at faculty, what they were doing, and knowing something of the history of anthropologists, archaeologists in the 20th century, there was a real tradition in archaeology, not just working in one area, but other regions. And my mentor, Wes Hurd, had worked in a lot of different areas. And it was something that I thought, I think there's still some of this. Everybody wants to work in Mongolia now in the discipline. And so with that in mind, and even though I had done work in a number of different areas, I'd been primarily interested in Western U.S. archaeology, I was looking to find a place that I could kind of do that. And I was actually trying to develop a program in Brazil. Wes Hurt had been a big player in Brazilian archaeology, and he was helping me try to, sort of open some doors. I had actually gone to Brazil to work with him and Alan Bryan, Ruth Gruen, who did Wilson Butte Cave here locally. Those connections, at another time and place, are very important, even spanning continents apparently. And I think they probably still are. But in that context, I was having difficulty making that work. One of the things that I had done with Wes Hurt was to take a readings course that looked at a number of different areas in South America, but was really focused in part, even though it was his area of expertise, on the Amazon. And as a result of that, I'd read, Evans and Megger's, sort of monograph on British Guiana and on the Guianas generally. Kind of on a lark, I decided to write someone at the University of Guyana and see if there was any possibility at all to sort of engage in a conversation about doing some archaeological work there. And I got an invite to come down.
So was this in the 80s? Or?
This was in the 80s. It was a time when I think Guyana still only had diplomatic ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union. So it was a difficult situation all the way around. So that's what got me there initially. Subsequently, it's taken many, many years to sort of develop that program. Unlike working here, where if there's someone at the University of Colorado that I want to do something with, we really, if money's not involved, we just pretty much have to agree to it and work out the details. Not the case in a developing situation like this. And so it's taken many years.
Because the government has to approve.
The government has to approve, virtually everything. They have an EPA which oversees archaeological work presently as well, and so there's just a lot of sort of boxes to be checked. No different than working in other international environments. But the fact that it was a British colony, the fact that I think there's sort of a love-hate relationship yet with the British. That was something that had to be overcome. There's a lot of racial politics in Guyana, was and still is, which has driven what people could do and so forth. So the politics, it took a long time to get beyond the politics.
So what year did you actually feel like things were off the ground and out of dialogue stage and
the early 2000s
Oh, wow.
is when we really began to do, we'd engaged in a number of projects, different types of projects, but since 2000 is when we've been doing most of the work there.
And talk to us a little bit about what that work looks like.
Well, one of the things, obviously if you're working in an international context, you're going to be working with international students who are, come to you in a variety of different ways. In the case of Guyana, one of the things I've always felt was important, perhaps more than some of the people that I've worked with, was the involvement of local Guyanese. And so all of the projects that we've done in Guyana, and we've done a lot of extensive work now from the rainforests of the north, particularly in the northwestern Guyana where we've been working in these shell middens, to the Berbice area and certainly the Rupununi savannas north of Brazil. We have always used undergraduate students. About 15 years ago, we created actually with the University of Guyana and the University of Virginia a field school program. George Mentor, who's a Guyanese anthropologist at the University of Virginia, has handled an ethnographic component and we've run the archaeological component. So the course of that period, we have trained somewhere around 100 students, Guyanese students, some of whom I've brought to the United States, and we've had a couple that have studied here at Boise State. We have one graduate student now sort of leading their Amerindian Research Unit at the University of Guyana as one of our graduate students. So we've been involved to a great extent that way and continue to be.
And you're still very involved there.
Yes, yes.
Right, and you plan to continue to be, it sounds like.
Well, this next week I'm presenting in the Earth Archive Congress in the Amazon. So yeah.
So let's sort of, as we wrap up here, I wanted to sort of close on a lighthearted note. You have a long history of having chickens as pets, and it was one of the first things that I noted in your memoir.
You know, they have histories that are, I think, probably unknown to most people. Spotty was a little banty hen that I had as a kid, actually, as a child. I think I had Spotty when I was about 7, 8 years old. Mm-hmm. And I had her until I was in my university career. I think she lived to be about 16.
And you have your current hen, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Orpie. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Orpie? I know you were very fussy in the process of picking out that particular breed.
Well, I've had chickens all my life, and but there was a period where, for a variety of different reasons, part of it going to Guyana a great deal, that I just couldn't keep a chicken. But a neighbor gave me a hen, an Aracuna hen, and her name was Flossie. Mm-hmm. And I had Flossie for 17 years, and she was a great friend, very smart chicken. And I promised her when she passed away that I wouldn't get another one for at least a year, which I didn't. But then I flew a couple of Orpingtons out from Connecticut, actually. Mm-hmm. And Orpingtons, they were developed, bred originally for small English farmsteads. They're widely known as the, sort of golden retrievers of chickendom, mm-hmm. for being very friendly birds. Mm-hmm. And so I have one, and her name is Orpie.
And does she follow you around like
yeah, of course she
dog
follows
would?
me around. If she were here, she'd come and jump up in our laps. She's a very interesting chicken. She's probably the greatest cuddler that I've ever had in chickendom. Loves to just get up and the only chicken that I've ever had that will get beak to nose with you, mm-hmm. and just stare you down.
So between Spotty and then Flossie, who I'm sorry, I had forgotten you had Flossie for so long, and Orpie, you've had chickens as pets for what, 30 years or something?
No, my entire life, actually.
Yeah, your entire life. Those are just the standout birds.
Yeah, including a couple of roosters,
mm-hmm.
But
mm-hmm.
nonetheless, they're a bit of a problem in the town.
Well, I look forward to meeting Orpie, by the way. So is there anything that we haven't discussed that you want on the record from sort of, some of the themes we've discussed, your childhood coming into the discipline?
In terms of talking to students over years, is that, they often want you to kind of lead them in a particular direction. It's like, here's the template. I think find your own way is probably the best way to go. One of the questions I usually get in this kind of context is, well, would you do it differently? Probably. I don't know that I could, I don't think I can say that if this or that had happened differently in my career, that I'd be in a different place. Mm-hmm. I mean, the decisions that you make that probably would have seen me having a somewhat different career, in terms of what I've done, where I've gone. That's always the case anyway, so I haven't worried about that. But at the end of the day.
So I guess what I'd like to finally ask is, when we first came to you with the idea for this project, and you were very enthusiastic, can you talk a little bit about what this project means to you, and maybe why you were keen to participate?
There's a lot of history that in the discipline of archaeology, at a lot of different levels and with many different people, ends up being lost. Well, I wish like hell that someone had done this with Wes. I remember I brought him to Boise State after he had retired to give a lecture. I was teaching a South American archaeology class, and as he started telling stories, it just kind of clicked with me. And then that kind of went away. And then some years later, Plains Anthropologist, the journal, had asked him to write a little piece reflecting on sort of project days, on the river basin series surveys. And I remember reading that, and when Will Lindley started pushing me about writing something like this memoir, all that kind of came back to me. And I connected with it particularly in the way that I realized You know, that's what this is about, really.
I thank you again for participating in this, letting the spotlight shine on you for a little bit, and we'll see you again for round 2.
So my first question is about your mentor. And the question is, if you could sit down with Wes Hurt today, what do you think you would want to talk about?
Well, I think any of us being in that position, I think so many questions could be anticipated. I think Wes would probably want to know something about, what's going on in Brazil, where we are with Paleo-Indian studies. We talked about that. I think he'd be pretty interested in what's going on in Idaho in that regard. I think as well he'd be interested in asking about and talking about where the field has kind of drifted since his retirement. I remember I was taking a graduate seminar and was taught by Pat Munson, titled The New Archaeology. And some of the senior faculty, archaeology faculty, would occasionally come, and Wes came with some degree of regularity, and said that when we were working at the Spotted Bear site in South Dakota in 1952, where he jumped to Brazil or Colombia or some other the Aleutian Islands, and he said, we were talking about that very thing, sort of echoing a sense that, the sort of old wine and new skin sort of thing that, was a bit of a theme on the part of some people during that period of time in the late 1970s, early 80s. So I think he'd be interested in going there probably a little bit. I think one of the other things he'd be interested in part because of his days in the field and river basin projects, is asking about cultural resource management and where that's gone. Toward the end of the 1990s, Indiana moved to create an option for people who wanted to pursue that track, and moved away from it very, very quickly.
Wow.
It didn't last longer than a couple of years. They decided it was not attracting the kind of student that they wanted, to be honest. We can circle back to that
Sure.
in terms of some of the other questions. And I think Wes was interested in that. I think he, as I do now, had concerns that the direction that seemed to be going wasn't one that he thought was probably in the best interest of the field.
So he was pretty active and engaged after retirement in what was going on.
Yeah, he continued to be. He assumed an honorary position at Harvard. Scotty McNeish, he had been longtime buddies, and I think McNeish had helped to facilitate that. He was emeritus at IU, but he continued to work on a number of different projects in Uruguay and in Brazil. Yeah.
Do you see a future?
I think some things have probably run their course a little bit more than others. For some reason, I don't see us being as engaged with ethnoarchaeology as we were 30 years ago. A longer tradition of that in American archaeology than we probably, we kind of forget. If you go back to, and we were talking about Wes, was heard a moment ago, if you go back to the period of the 30s and 1940s, a lot of people, not dabbling, but doing work across sort of four-field approach. Wes did a good deal of, ethnological work as well, and I always felt, he always talked about that being important to him in terms of the way in which he thought about archaeological problems. And there are a number of contemporary archaeologists, Bob Kelly's one of them, who I think, has his ability to think well about a number of archaeological problems has benefited greatly from the fact that he's done ethnoarchaeological research into people that I think have been most influential in terms of moving us along, from Bedford to, a number of folks. I said it, I hope that doesn't go away.
Me too.
My guess is it's going to come back a little bit over time. As to some of the other approaches, I think we're going to continue to see experimental, engagement. In terms of lithics, I'm less certain about that because I think the problem with lithic research, the experimental sort of work that craftery is tied to. While there are a lot of incredibly important things that came out of Don's work and the work of others who were engaged in that program, I don't think that lithic analysts have found a way to connect that with sort of bigger questions.
Throughout the 1970s and 80s, theoretical debates were carried out in a highly public arena, in conferences, in publications, often with swords drawn. Do you see a future for robust and vigorous theoretical debates in archaeology?
Well, I think first of all, a lot of those debates were not really truly theoretical. Speaking out as a philosopher of science now, not an archaeologist so much, I think they were more methodological.
Good point.
But that said, I do and I don't. I think there will be in some instances debates that probably have some, greater play. But I think the time of the debates that you're talking about or asking about are really at another time and place at that level. There was a point in the field where we were really still sort of finding ourselves a little bit in terms of coming out of the 1950s, 60s and moving on. So very different approaches, a very different way of thinking about things generally. And I think that spawned a lot of debates. And I do think a lot of it was more methodological than theoretical. And some would say, yeah, there was a lot of theory that came out of that period anyway, so maybe, and that speaks to the reality of it. I think one of the things that's happened more recently, and it reflects the changing course of archaeological research, whereby the availability of techniques that allow us to engage in research that certainly as an undergraduate student I couldn't imagine doing, has spawned an era where we have a lot more collaborative work than we formerly had. I think because of that, within what are many different sort of approaches and orientations now, which in and of themselves are not really spawning the kind of debate that I think you're asking about, I think there's a little less of it.
Yeah.
It's hard to find a paper in any major journal that would have 5 or 6 authors. You go to Science, it's 25. And so we can talk about that later as well in terms of what that means, and both ways, positively and negatively. But I do think that has had probably a tendency to kind of tone down some of the rhetoric, some of the back and forth. You've got more people on board with a particular approach. There's probably going to be a little less of that. I don't think it'll go away, and I think to some, I miss it, frankly. I think that having been involved in it a little bit myself on a couple of occasions, it gets personal now and again, but, the people that are really truly scholars get over that and
Right.
find a way around it. So, I don't know.
I miss it a little bit too.
I'd like to think so.
Well, and this is maybe a bit of a follow-on with more of a sort of a geographic case of your area of research. You've been front and center in some of the most significant research in equatorial South American archaeology. In fact, I should maybe even qualify that as equatorial. I mean, you've done a lot of South American archaeology. How do you feel that some of the previous researchers, some of your predecessors have influenced what you do there?
My introduction, I guess, in a way, to South American archaeology, and I'm speaking largely about Amazonian archaeology, was through the work of those people. So, but I think in terms of their influence on my work, it's been more, and it's certainly true with respect to both Wes Hurt, certainly Betty Meggers, is they're having influenced me in terms of thinking about just doing archaeology. The sort of how-to of it, the willingness to go out and get it done and go a little bit beyond what was needed to be done, or finding ways to do things that were not easy. The one thing I learned from those people like that has been most influential in my career, and the way in which I've engaged with other people who are up and coming in the discipline that I've worked with, was their incredible work ethics.
What would you consider are the foremost sort of theoretical challenges or theoretical sort of areas facing archaeology today, and analytical challenges facing both archaeology and anthropology sort of in that package in South America? Sort of keep it to South America for another question.
It's hardly theoretical. it's people are pots and pots through time,
Oh, boy.
and and at this point in time, it kind of this speaks probably to some of the greater problems and issues in geotrophic or Amazonian archaeology. Uh, there are very few studies that are really framed, from my point of view, in a truly theoretical manner. It just isn't there. I think at times over the course of the last 30 years plus, there have been opportunities and some awakenings to another way of thinking, but I think it's probably been less the case with archaeologists than it has been some of the anthropology types. In Brazil, for example, there are a number of cultural people that kind of off of the Emilio Moran, sort of rotted ecology, have come to think a little bit better about a number of things. And there are some Brazilian anthropologists, Neves and others who are beginning to think a little bit better on the archaeological side. But I think really a lot of the Amazon remains sort of locked into a very, very old way of thinking. If you go to the south, Argentina
Yes.
and south into Patagonia generally, there's some interesting work that's coming out of there. Thinking of Willie Barrera, for example, as someone who's in a very different track. This is much more processual kind of orientation. Thinking as I'd like to see us think better about things in the Amazonian area. It's troubling to be able to accomplish that. I think part of it is historical in terms of the preparation and training of people. If you go to Brazil, for example, to their credit, Cliff Evans and Betty Meggers, major players establishing from Hoppen and so forth. And, so they trained in their tradition, a couple of generations of archaeologists. It's been hard for them to break out there, I think, more than in other areas, particularly in the South. There seems to be some differences there in terms of, the traditions. In the Amazon, we always want to fall back on preservation issues and so forth, and they're there, but we just got to think beyond all of that. I think adopting more of an evolutionary ecological sort of framework would benefit us greatly there. One of the things about working in the Amazon is that I continue to be absolutely, I'm just, it's hard for me to imagine that at this point, 30 years out. And the work of a number of people, including Heckenberger, the sort of historical anthropology, which is incredibly naive and moves it back to the Boasian era, in terms of the way we think so badly about things that are just, it's troubling. So I think it's, it's going to take some time. In the Amazon itself, I think we'll get there, but it's going to take more people being interested in working there.
What role do you see for evolutionary approaches, and specifically human behavioral ecology, sort of framing approaches for sorting through maybe or refreshing archaeological research questions?
Through archaeology, in my graduate career, evolutionary ecology and the sort of emerging human behavioral ecological track. I think it's worth noting that even the major players in HBE now, Wetterhalder, for example, through the sort of HBE 20 years out, as I recall the title, gives credit to archaeologists for being the pioneers in that program, and we were, of course. So I embraced that program, and I opened the door to it at Boise State. I hired John Zeig, and I have been supporting of additional hires on that track, and having the department have an evolutionary focus. I think that's absolutely critical. Otherwise, we struggle to have a. So I support it, and I think in terms of archaeology, I think it continues to be, a perfect way to frame a lot of the questions that we want to ask, that we've been asking for some time, and I think you're going to probably continue to ask over the course of the next couple of decades.
In your view, what characteristics do you think have served you best as a mentor to future archaeologists? And do you have advice for people who are coming into the mentoring game?
Wes in particular was adamant that, when you took on an archaeological project, that you did that for good reason. He was adamant that you did the very best that you could do by time, by circumstance. he was adamant that you had a responsibility to report on that and not let it run for 30 years. And I remember him talking to me about, the fact that all too often he felt that people were just unwilling to really basically sacrifice sometimes. He was talking about the fact that for, a number of years, that he was never home for Thanksgiving. Because the Plains Conference always met on Thanksgiving Day, literally. And he, as you may know, he's the one who defended Anna Roosevelt when Meggers was after her in a major way. At any rate, those are the things that have most influenced my career in terms of which I've thought about doing things and so forth.
Well, what would you say to a brand new faculty member coming into the mentoring game?
I would urge them to be honest with students. I think that a lot of academic faculty, and I get it, and I understand that academic faculty enjoy feeling good about, students telling them good job and valuing them in different ways. But I think there's a lack of honesty about what it takes to be a professional archaeologist, anthropologist. What that's going to mean or what you should be willing to sign on for. It's critical.
How have anthropology students changed throughout your career? Just sort of a few sort of observations, quick observations, or maybe a more in-depth one?
Well, being an old guy now, of course I'm supposed to say that it's changed drastically.
Kids today,
Kids today, it's nothing like it was, I think we do have fewer students that are, really committed to a long-term professional career, academic career in particular.
Yes.
The one thing that and this goes back to maybe that question that Wes would want to ask me about cultural resource management. That's the one thing that I think is well ignored in the level of change to students that I've been working with in the last 15 years. Is that for the very first time really didn't exist when I was in graduate school, really just beginning to come on. There's a track for you if you don't want to be an academic researcher that you can work in and around archaeology. Whether or not you're an archaeologist in the traditional sense, that's another matter. It's debatable. But cultural resource management, I think, has changed the nature of the students that we see now in this part. And not just here, but in a lot of different places probably. The very first field school that we ran at Boise State had 25 students.
Wow.
And all but 2 of them got graduate degrees.
Wow.
Master's degrees, there were 3 PhDs.
Wow.
In the last 15 years, we've had very few students that have gone to graduate to field schools that are planning to go on. They really want a career in cultural resource management.
Do you think that the growing participation of women, people of color, non-binary people in our field, in archaeology and anthropology generally, is influencing the ways that we approach the enterprise, both how we think about why we do what we do and how we do it?
I think the latter is true. I would probably question whether or not the entry of those, folks into the discipline have really been the source of any sort of new theoretical orientations. Women have long historically involved in anthropology and archaeology. It's one thing problem in terms of academic disciplines. And in the 20th century, very notable influence. So many different levels in the field, and otherwise, theoretically, in other ways.
Yep.
And administratively. For African American anthropologists, archaeologists, I think we're probably going to see a greater interest in historical archaeology. Where that goes, I don't know what time. I think it's been influencing. I think in positive ways. I think we're still finding our way through it.
Yep.
As we look at hiring in academic departments, where there still is a critical imbalance in terms of gender in many instances.
Where do you see indigenous participation, indigenous expertise headed in our discipline?
I think it depends on the area. I think in Western North America, we have, not across the board by any means, but we have considerable issues in dealing with tribal peoples, which has in large part to do with our unwillingness as a profession to engage them. When I first moved to Idaho, we worked in areas that for the Dug Valley, Shoshone Paiute peoples, are still areas that are sacred and are utilized by elders. And I wouldn't say that I was then, as I am now, as aware of that. But essentially no one cared. There was no engagement at all in terms of that. And one can argue, and I have with myself, said, why didn't we think to be there?
Right.
And I think we all, I think many of us probably at times thought about that. Probably constrained a little bit by the academic frame of that, by its time and place. That's where we're sort of, undercutting traditional takes on ethnographic analogy and that kind of thing. That's in play. I think in the Western United States, it's going to take us some time to really come, full circle in regard to being able to answer that question more fully as to what the level of cooperation would be. There are two parts to that. There's cooperation, tribal cooperation, in terms of, tribes being engaged with archaeological work to their benefit, and sometimes, as they see it, to a lesser extent, to their benefit. And then having, Native people come into the research side. That can happen in different ways as well. We don't have a lot of Native American archaeologists at the moment. We'll probably see more of them over time. But a good long time, I think, probably in reality. Because it's going to take these changes at other levels first. Now, one of the things that I think will begin to move this along is just time. When in Idaho, I was, fortunate to have been involved in a consultation program, the Wings So-Called Wings and Roots consultation program, initiated by the Idaho Army National Guard. It was the first of its kind. It was designed to really do something that never happened before, which was to bring tribal people in as consultants, as co-equals at the table in terms of all of the planning stages of developing a document, which traditionally was written internally by the agency, then sent to the tribe and said, what do you think? So this was novel, and it took, there was a lot of screaming and yelling and gnashing of teeth for a long time. But it essentially established a level of communication based on some level of trust and simply knowing one another that enabled us to get to a point where we can say, okay, I understand your take on this, your perspective, but I can only go there. I can only go so far. And we got to the point where we could find those points. It became for a period of time, a program used by DoD pretty widely in the Western United States, and I felt very positive about it. The problem in part was that the people that were, on the tribal side had a lot of pent-up feeling, a lot of pent-up anger about having been ignored forever in terms of some university projects is changing a little bit. Not entirely. We're still very long-standing legitimate concerns about a number of things. But it's I think, a hopeful sign. As I think about South America, again, it depends on where you are. In the Guianas, it varies enormously. Tribal people in Guyana are more organized and beginning to exert their influence in a way that's apart, I think, from Suriname and French Guiana, where there's a different dynamic completely. where one of our speakers in the Earth archive Congress was unable to speak because he had permission from the French government.
Wow.
So you get those kinds of things that are in play, and the long histories and longer histories that you have handy in region. In Guyana, they have a formal ministry of American affairs, and you now begin to see that catching on in the local governments of the American villages across the south, particularly. How that's going to play in terms of engagement at the research level. One of the things that I've insisted, we have here in Idaho actually run Native American field schools to train Native American students. All of the projects that I've done in South America, I've required that we have indigenous students work with.
That's awesome.
So we've always had, persons of color in terms of this race situation we have in Guyana. We've had people across that board, all bringing very unique perspectives oftentimes of what we're doing, but always indigenous students working with us. And I think that, it speaks in part about who we are and who we should be as professional anthropologists or archaeologists. But it also has to speak to the commitment that we've got to have when we go to we're working at home, when we're working in distant lands.
Right.
That commitment to give everything that we possibly can to sort of see this in a way that is beneficial and productive for the people that we work with.
And it's just been an amazing collegial and friendship that's gone on for a real long time, and it's really been of incalculable value to me as a person and as a professional archaeologist. So I feel pretty lucky to be sitting here with you asking these questions.
Well, that goes certainly for me as well. I have a long working relationship. I would hope that, generally speaking, it's one of the things that we don't lose as we move into the future. Not just our relationship, but in terms of the discipline in general.
Yep.
I do have a sense that some of that has changed. I don't think we're the cowboys of science anymore. Just as an example of that, there was a working relationship amongst people that I knew early on in my career that is gone.
Yeah.
So hopefully we don't walk away from that, because that's a big part of this. And it's the personal relationships that we've established that have brought us in contact with different people, expanded our way of thinking about this, that, and the other, afforded us opportunities to go and do and experience in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise. It'd be a shame for that to be lost in the field.
Well, I'm glad we could all be in the same room, same space, and I think that wraps us up for today. And we'll think about some possibilities for the future discussion with the group. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to fire off with the first question, which I think you might enjoy. In your view, what characteristics have served you best as a mentor yourself? To future archaeologists, and what would your advice be to people who are just getting into the mentoring game?
I mean, I wonder if you don't think about mentoring students. I'm not sure that I never thought in those terms. I mean, I think we've all done things that we're mentoring in a variety of different ways. But I think most of what you impart, you probably end up imparting from the more positive experiences that you gain from the people that you worked with early in your career. Because the things that I would want to suggest to any student about, be thinking about this and that as you kind of move into the field, are things that I learned from other people that kind of stuck with me.
Mine were things that I learned from my mentors at Indiana was don't do this and don't do that and stay away from this and stay away from that.
Yeah, I remember a little of that.
That was my reaction to the professors at IU. So.
Did you know each other at Indiana?
We were in grad school together.
Yeah.
Tom was
Oh,
ahead
okay.
of me a little bit.
Okay. I was under the impression you met each other in Idaho, but
No, we met there.
Yeah, a long
Okay.
time ago.
Jim, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Well, I'm like Mark. I don't know that the term mentor really has ever been foremost on my mind, but when you think about the classic definition of mentor, it's always surprising to me how many ex-students, how many years later, contact you again.
Yeah.
10, 15 years later.
Yep.
I haven't heard from him in a decade. and they say, hey, I just finished. Here's the link to my dissertation. I'm now going to work over here. And I'm like, who was this person? Which was so long ago. But after all those years, they still touch bases. And I'm sure you hear from students long ago.
Yeah, some fellow just wrote me a note. There's some function here. I know his daughter is graduating back in May. I get this note, and he's in Wisconsin. And it was the same kind of thing. I have no idea who this person is, but I saved them from something, I think.
Maybe the term mentor sounds too uppity,
I don't know. It sounds like people who hang out in a thing with robes, and
Well, it's another one of those things, if you think about it, that no one ever said anything to me about being a mentor.
No.
Or ever think about being a mentor at any place along the road.
No.
Yeah.
They don't tell you. I mean, graduate school is not. They don't talk about that. They don't tell you how to teach a class. They don't do anything.
No, they
So,
don't.
I know the first class I did teach, I had 1 year as an academic at Iowa State. And the first class I taught, I walked in and there were 400 kids sitting in the auditorium. And I went, oh my shit. What am I going to do here? And I couldn't, obviously I needed a microphone. It was this huge auditorium. And I didn't know, and I'm trying to figure out where it is and how to work it. And there's some kid on the 30th row. It's on the right. Turn the left button. And it was like, oh. Anyway.
I think there was, maybe Tom, what did you mention that there was sort of like this sort of classist thing maybe going on between,
that was,
where people end up in archaeology. Oh, okay.
Right.
So, I know that in the past, cultural resources management has sort of been viewed as this bin, this gray literature bin that people end up in. It's sort of like a consolation prize, and it's not really viewed as the ivory, as having the status of the ivory tower, and so on and so forth. I think that was certainly the case in the 60s and 70s, when cultural resources management was just a baby, right? I mean, NHPA is 1966. The laws before that were not really very powerful. But I think it's safe to say that's changed quite a bit, in the last 3-4 decades. So from what you know about, like your own participation in CRM, and what you're seeing maybe with younger people's participating in it, what do you think the future is looking like for that?
A CRM career might be a better route in some ways. I was just looking at, it is so hard these days. You have to, University of Arkansas, when they were hiring an archaeologist in the department, they would get over 100 applications. And everybody wanted a tenure track job.
Yep.
And the survey, we had great jobs at the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, but we didn't have tenure. And we would get 15 or 20 applications. And it's like, are you guys nuts? You just got your PhD, you want to do research. Here's the responsibilities of a station archaeologist, which is you have to teach 1 or maybe 2 classes a year at the host institution, and the rest of the time you can do research. So anyway, no, I don't know. I think there still is a difference there, though, but not always. There's a lot of CRMers the difference is the publications and the peer review. And there's a lot of CRMers who do publish. You can think of Kaiser with Forest Service, written lots of stuff on rock art, and there's a number of people. Lexon was another one, came out of CRM,
Kaiser too.
published lots of stuff, and so there's, I think the difference is who publishes and who doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's true largely. If you look in the region here, there are people with Far West, Metcalf. These are firms.
Yeah.
But they have a real focus on still trying to be academic and so forth.
Yeah.
One thing about it, there's always been this academic thing. I remember when I was first here, Pavasek was very anti, cultural resource stuff. And I was kind of at that time kind of championing it. Now I moved away from that significantly and don't feel the same way about it. But at the same time, we've all largely academically benefited greatly.
Oh, yeah.
Great way to
Otherwise.
train a lot of
Sure.
students.
And it is that too.
I mean,
Absolutely.
my CV is full of
Absolutely.
projects
Yeah.
of
One of your questions on here has to do directly with CRM. Oh, the connection between theoretical research and cultural resource management.
Right.
How do you see the future? Well, it comes down to the significance statement. Can you make a point for why this site's eligible for the National Register? No matter what the theory is, but you got a new theory,
Right.
and you can see the development of CRM through the years.
But in terms of like what Mark was saying, you don't open up American antiquity and see one person laying it on the line in a theoretical sense.
Rare.
Yeah.
You don't. And this is the direction that the discipline has gone. But it harkens back to, I remember having a conversation with Lou about CRM. And his comment to me was, CRM is a lot like having socialized medicine in the mid-19th century. It's all leeches and enemas.
Going back to two-year students, and
Yeah.
they leave my institution and go elsewhere, so I lose track of them for a couple years, and then they're writing for letters of recommendation for work, and it's oftentimes Forest Service, BLM, Idaho Power. So I watch them go on to these agency positions, and I have certain thoughts, or had certain thoughts about that. But what is interesting, and I can think of one specific instance recently, is some of these students have been wanting some very obscure literature because there's kind of an interest in stemmed Haskell points.
Oh.
And they're writing for all this interesting stuff, and it's like, oh man, I haven't seen that paper in years. I'm not sure where I'd find that. And it's an Idaho Power archaeologist
Yeah.
or a BLM archaeologist in Pocatello. And it's like, well, it's kind of odd. Why are they doing that? It's not coming from ISU or some other school. It's coming from an agency. And I know they have an agenda they're after, but it just didn't seem to me like the kind of things they'd be contacting me for. And that's happened quite a few times in the last few years. I've been kind of surprised by that.
I think it might come back to what Tom is saying, pardon me for sort of jumping in here, which is they might be writing up eligibility determinations.
Mm-hmm.
And they're looking for those obscure references in order to make a case.
One of your questions here about field schools. Yes, there's a role for field schools, and labs classes on how do you analyze lithics, how do you describe pottery, all those classes.
But they're changing a lot on the academic side. I think about what field schools were like 50 years ago or when we took one,
Right?
what they are today. I was just talking with our new hire,
Yeah.
Eric Robinson, about ISU's field school this summer. A lithics field school.
Oh, is that what
It's
it
a
is?
rock-breaking
Yeah.
field school.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. They keep shrinking from 8 to 6 to 4 to a 3-week wonder. I mean, well, let's just go survey.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
How do you think the relationships between the field of archaeology and indigenous communities have evolved, and where do you think they're headed? Where do you hope they're headed?
Well, I think we're natural allies in the long run, and we, at least to protect the resource. So.
Generally.
And I think it depends on which tribes you're talking about
Yep.
and where you are. We didn't have any trouble in Arkansas, but then we're dealing with Oklahoma tribes mainly. So, and we could all be sitting here and you couldn't tell who was a Choctaw and who was a Cherokee. In fact, I can't think of her name. I'm getting too old. Anyway, she's fair-haired as you're going to get, wears a hat completely covered from the sun, and she's a card-carrying member of the Choctaw. She's an archaeologist who used to live in Sandpoint. And we got along fine with the Shoshone and the Nez Perce when I was here, the Shoshone Bannock.
Yeah, and I think those relationships have held generally.
Yeah.
But they have much longer histories behind them than the Shopai. and
That's
Duck
true.
Valley.
Yeah.
I mean, with Duck Valley, NAGPRA, the changes of BIA, it all came at the same time, and they were relatively isolated anyway.
Yeah, true.
And it's been tougher for them to kind of...
Yeah.
But I think it's generational at one level. The one thing that I see changing a lot at Duck Valley, we have a tribal member who's part of their family, still lives in Doug Valley, who was one of our majors.
Oh, yeah.
And on her own this is Vicki Stark, did a survey at Doug Valley, 2 or 3 years ago now, just kind of testing the waters in terms of the issues that we're talking about here and some others. What she found was that, the overwhelming number of people she talked to were relatively supportive,
Yeah.
and in a very different place. And the new tribal government,
Yeah.
and some of the new people, and they're related to old people.
Yeah.
One of Terry's sons is
Oh,
very
really? The
prominent now.
Osbournes are not.
But
is it
that's
the
it, I mean,
Osbournes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's changing.
You think, Russell, do you got any thought about where we ought to be, where we hope to be, maybe, going forward with indigenous descendants and experts and
I
governments?
have no idea where things are now because I was always a number and data guy, so I was always trying to hoover all the stuff out of that exists within the SHPO's offices and whatnot. And
But I would second what Mark said about there's so much variability in opinions on the reservations
Yeah.
or among the tribes. When the Buell skeleton first came out and we notified the tribal, they didn't have a cultural committee at the time, so we notified the tribal chair and the council, and they were like, and we told them, this is old, we don't know exactly how old, we don't think it's a direct descendant of any of your people, but they were like, oh, wow, this is great, and what do you need? I said, well, we want to get a radiocarbon date, we want to use part of her arm. They said, okay, great, go do it, yeah, report back. And then when we reported back, we had to deal with the cultural committee, which was all traditional religious leaders. Because, as we all know, there's also Episcopalians and Mormons and Lutherans and everybody else on the reservation. It's not all, traditional
right.
people.
Yeah.
And then they had a fit. Who gave you permission to do this? I said, well, your tribal council. And they were like, oh, those heathens. So anyway.
Well, I think in the Idaho context, for a long time there hasn't been a lot of interest in engaging.
Yeah.
That's my opinion, but I think that's really the case. At all levels, I don't think the academics have been particularly responsive for the most part. There are exceptions. Rick Sprague certainly at U of I
Yeah,
has worked with
right.
an S-PERS that goes back to the 1960s.
Yeah.
And deserves a lot of credit for that. Well, one of the things, I was involved with the so-called Wings and Roots
Oh, yeah.
program,
I've heard
which
about
has changed a lot now and it's not as dynamic as I think it was at one point. But, one of the things that was happening there is that for the first time you had a federal agency that was bringing the tribe in as a consulting partner in the process of developing a document. And there was a lot of bloodshed in the context of doing that, some pale moments. But the bottom line, I think that is, to your point, that is how it has to go.
Yeah.
There's got to be constant sort of engagement. And as we've moved away from that in Idaho,
Yeah.
and there were things that were right with that process, but as we've moved away from that kind of consultation, we have far less. And we have something I think is short of the relationship we had probably 15 years ago with Duck Valley.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this kind of raises an area of collaborative relationships and will maybe allow us to talk a little bit more about actualistic archaeology, which we talked about a little bit ago. I wanted to invite Jim to sort of talk about his work in Mexico that actually brings in Mexican students and community members around actualistic archaeology. And how is that going?
In Mexico, it's a whole different situation. We're dealing there with American students who are foreigners, and then the national students who come from all over Mexico. And we bring them together once in a while for collaborative field school. It's kind of informal. And we sit around and work kind of in a Crabtree-esque tradition, starting with simple things. But in the process of that, we get a chance to talk to them and find out their motive for coming and participating. And the problem in Mexico right now is nobody's looking for lithics people. They want people who do architectural reconstruction. They want people who do pigment research, pottery research. but making replicas of stone tools, I mean, so the students come in and you start teaching them basic flint knapping techniques, and they're doing it because they're curious, but they don't see it as a career opportunity. It's not anything that's going to help them on their resume. And I was surprised at that, but then when I started talking to some of the American students, it was almost the same thing, because in their institutions, almost without exception, flint knapping is something that's kind of you do as part of a club. You know, it's not a class. And if it's talked about in a class, it's a 1 or 2 day seminar taught by a graduate student. But there's no lithic courses. There's certainly no experimental courses. So a lot of these students had little tiny labs that were basically in a closet, and if they could go get their own stone somewhere, there was a place for them to work, but it wasn't really any part of a career path. You know, they said, first of all, we don't have time for this. If you look at our curriculum, the classes we have to take, the amount of time we need to spend in the library, we do not have time to sit and break rocks. We just simply don't have that kind of time. And it was almost a universal response. And the Mexican response was, well, we have the time, but there's no career path. You know, nobody wants to be a lithic specialist because that relegates you to certain kinds of sites. You want to be architecture or ceramics. The demand for an experimental lithics person is very low right now. But there were students, there was one I remember who was working on a big site in Mexico where there were hundreds of thousands of prismatic blades. And he said he had read every paper that he could get his hands on, mostly out of North America, on how to analyze prismatic blades. But the only thing he could find on making prismatic blades was an old paper by Crabtree and some YouTube videos. And he said he'd never made a blade. He wasn't sure how to push one off. He understood the concept of a clamp and a chest crutch, but he didn't know the actual mechanism. So he said, I've got all these literally millions of blade fragments. I have them sorted for length and width and thickness and raw material type and all this stuff, but he said, I don't know what it means. In the end, he said, I have to write a report and a conclusion, and I don't know what to say about it. He said, I understand all the stuff you teach, all the statistical stuff. He said, I've got that, but I don't know what it really means. But it showed the level of misunderstanding of what was involved, and which brought up another interesting point when students would learn how long you have to spend to do this. Say, oh, we don't have the time for that. Because in Mexico, at least, a lot of the students were married and had families, and they had jobs. And so their academic studies were aside from that. And so they can't go sit in the lab and make obsidian bifaces. They've got to be out working and making money. So I think there's a place for it, but I'm not sure this is the time for it right now. I don't know.
I think, well, but the thing is that it requires a lot of very fundamental experimental work, really. And it requires the combination of a variety of skill sets. And I think that's probably the biggest problem, is that, you know, this guy could break rocks all day long with the best of them. But when it comes to sitting down and throwing it all on the ground and let's come up with a quantifiable way to, discern different production points or techniques that we can use, that's not your skill set. You're good at spotting these specific things, saying, look at this, look at this, look at this. Because I would love working with you guys or going with Gene, to look at some site, and it was always great because it just oh, look at the, it'd be like, look at this thing right here. And so much was available and accessible by just making that particular observation. But how do you go from what is the largest, sort of data set that we excavate here in Idaho, which is a bunch of broken rocks? How do you go from that to being able to make a knowledge claim about all that stuff? And nobody's doing that connect the dots kind of research. And I mean, it's really very middle rangey and it's not very glamorous, but it's fundamental to being able to say, this is why this resource is relevant.
Any other thoughts about actualistic approaches, experimental approaches that?
Well, I was just thinking a moment ago that Jim, if I'm not wrong, got a humanities grant a few years ago to do kind of a nationwide look at programs that had walked
Yeah.
away from lithic classes, basically.
Yeah, and I did. I spent a year online and on the phone talking to people. I started with some of the old Crabtree Field School students who were still around, and expanded out from there into second and third generation Crabtree students. And I found a couple places that said, "Oh yeah, we teach lithics classes." So I got their catalog, and they teach once every 3 years. You know, half a semester class, or they used to teach them and they don't anymore, or make replicas of Clovis points. The replicas go into a lab in the Midwest. They get hafted and mounted on a mechanical Indian, a machine, and then propelled at targets and
Yes.
broken to measure study breakage variables. And that's their lithic analysis class, which is fine. I mean, I'm interested in the way Clovis points break. I
Right,
think that's
yeah.
fascinating. But they're not doing the flint knapping in the lab, and they're not doing it with anthro students.
I would like to actually move toward a question that Nikki has for you guys that is not on the list, but I think it's a really, really great question, and I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys all for participating in this. It's been fascinating to, as a non-archaeologist, as a cultural anthropologist, to hear all your perspectives. So my question is, can you each articulate the most impactful aspect of your friendship with each other?
I mean, I think to a great extent we all have different levels of engagement for different reasons in our histories. But I think it's keeping us in the, keeping us in the play a little bit. As Jim was talking about this earlier, knowing who's where and
Yeah, right.
and what they're doing and that kind of thing. Because at the end of the day, it isn't so much what any of us have really done, and it's more who we knew along the trail, as it were. All of those relationships, those engagements, good, bad, and otherwise, in some instances. But I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, I think we've all got along despite differences. We've had some disagreements at times, but we haven't taken them personal.
No.
But some people do.
Yeah, we certainly live in the age of outrage.
We do.
Yes. Yes.
So,
So maybe I think to a project that happened down in my area with Baker Cave that Mark was
Yeah.
involved with, and
that was a good one.
it just happened. Nobody knew that some guy was going to stumble on it, and it was going to be discovered, and it was going to raise a bunch of public attention, and that the BLM was going to be worried about it. They didn't have time to plan or budget. It just happened, and something had to be done. And as I recall, and Mark, I'm sure, knows the story intimately, but the BLM went around Burley District, where this site was, went around to everybody, ISU, and said, we need this taken care of right away.
Yep.
And it's like, well, do you have any money? No, we don't have any money, but we need to have this taken care of because people are getting in there. In fact, stuff's being looted out as we speak. And, within a very short time, I'm going to say a couple of weeks, there was a busload of Boise State students pulling in there to get the
Yeah.
work done. And there was no money, as I recall. I mean, they had a little bit. I think they offered a little bit for food or something. But it wasn't a paid project. It wasn't a contract thing. There was no planning. And nobody wanted to do it anywhere else. But Mark said, well, we'll get it done. And to me, and I've thought about this quite a few times, that's a commitment that's based on a passion for what you do. And it's care and concern beyond your teaching, your job, your salary back at school. None of that factors into it. It's just something that needs to be done because that's what you do as an archaeologist.
I think a lot of the fact is that friendships are forged out of these kinds of
Yeah.
ethical kinds of concerns. It's like, yeah, we share some values on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes you just go out and do that work.
It's got to get done.
But I think one of my favorite lines along this comes from Rusty Greaves.
Good old Rusty.
Because Rusty said, no one ever gets rich doing archaeology, but at least our bad ideas don't kill anybody.
A lot of stuff that we interpret through filters from sites around us.
Yes, and
You
that's been the
know?
whole story of, really, I think a lot of Mark's career is trying to move beyond that.
Yeah, I know. So I don't know. I think a state archaeologist who is active would be helpful to coordinate things. So,
No question. I think one of the things that's changed a lot in the time that we've all been involved, as you talk about Swanson, is that we don't have any strong personalities
yeah.
in Idaho archaeology any longer. Good, bad, or otherwise.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
not everybody, we didn't always get along, but, there was a lot of movement, and
That's
that hasn't
true.
been there for a really long time.
Yeah, that goes back to the mentor question. My mentor,
does.
Merle, would always ask me, he would read some historic or we'd talk about, well, this site's important for archaeology, and he'd go, then it would be a historic site.
Yeah,
He'd
of
go,
course it would be.
I said, but it's Chinese. We don't know anything about the Chinese. He says, well, have any historians even looked into it? He says, there's probably some document somewhere that explains the whole damn thing, And it's true. I mean, in a sense, Merle was right on this. He didn't have much regard for most historic archaeology. And I remember down in the Birds of Prey, there's that, oh God, I was down there with a tour of birders one time, and I was supposed to be the color person. They hired me for a Saturday to float down.
Oh,
Well,
right.
we didn't float, we drove. And, we drive through Nampa, and they go, what crop is that? And I go, those are sugar beets. Sugar beets? Who grows sugar beets? Well, we do. So anyway, but they came to this lava, it's just a building out there on Wiesbar. You know where that one is?
Sure.
And the guy says, Tom, tell us about that building. I said, I don't know anything about it. And he says, oh, but that's the cathedral in the canyon. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, that's what all the outfitters say, that was a church. And I went, well, how do they know that? And he goes, well, I don't know, that's what they said. So I came back and asked Merle. Merle goes, well, I don't know. I don't think so. And then so I thought, well, if the outfitters are saying that, we need to go down there and put a few pits around it and see what it really is. And so we were just about ready to start, and Margaret Wyatt, who was the BLM archaeologist
Right.
at the time, says, Tom, stop. I just found this lawsuit. It's about 400 pages that describe that building. Now that was Merle's point,
Right.
There's got to be some archival research done here before you get involved in this kind of stuff with historic sites. So anyway, I'll shut
I
up
think the
now.
Chinese underground is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Pendleton makes bundles of money running a Chinese underground facility. And nobody ever thinks to ask Chinese people,
Did you dig a hole?
did you or your ancestors ever live underground like burrowing people? Excuse me for just raising that one, but that one persists. It's amazing how sticky these things are.
Oh yeah.
Paylin, you may be interested. The Historical Society has a huge Chinese collection. Merle, when they were tearing down downtown, there was a Chinese pharmacy that was still there. He went in and collected everything out of it, all the stuff. He had no idea what he got, but he just took it out there because he would do stuff like that.
I know we didn't cover everything. Is there something that's just burning a hole in your pockets that you would like to talk about to sort of wind it down?
Yeah, Plew.
Yeah.
This project was something that I didn't want to do in the first place.
His usual level of enthusiasm.
Well, thanks, good. And I was convinced, well, I didn't want to write the memoir either, but I was convinced by somebody else who pushed and pushed and pushed about doing it. And I did it. It was like a little more interesting than I thought it would be. I had to cut 100 pages out of it to keep from getting into trouble, I think, in some instances, but regardless.
Oh, so there's nothing about me in it then.
We need to have an addendum published.
And I was less certain about this. But actually the interviews that we've done previously were kind of fun.
Yeah.
And this has been really actually kind of interesting. And I think the dialogue has evolved in a way that I wasn't sure that it would. That's not entirely accurate either. I mean, we've all kind of spoken in ways I thought we would. And we're all kind of on the same page in a lot of ways. Well, except for Gould here. He's got some numbers rattling around in there somewhere.
Always.
At any rate. So it's been entertaining.
Yeah.
I think these kinds of things, it's hard to see the value beforehand. It starts to become a little clearer while you're doing the thing. And then down the road, it's like, oh yeah, that was valuable. Maybe not in the way you thought it was going to be. But just the knowledge, we're talking about cumulatively a lot of years of archaeology and archaeological practice and thinking about archaeology and doing it.
And where are you going with that?
I'm not going to say how many centuries of experience that we have right here on this patio. But I want
And literally minutes of knowledge as a result.
Clearly,
Okay, ready? Here we go.
the one thing that emerged out of this.
And honestly, I wish we could have more people sitting here.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, the state of Idaho archaeology, as far as I see it, is really tenuous and sort of, in a way, it could go in any direction, but that includes good directions. Well, thank you guys. I think this has been amazing, and I think once we start looking at the edited product, it's going to be pretty exciting. Did we really say that? So I think that Russell and Jim are in full sunlight. You might want to scoot your chairs.
Yeah, I got
Yeah.
But yeah, I think at this point it's like we're good.